Hello. I've just started the session.
You start it now?
Hello, it's evening to you all. Apologies for the delay in starting. As you can see, we are just trying to get our heads around this new platform, but we are so grateful that you could to be this evening. We're looking forward to a very insightful presentation from Lee Lambert. This man has got a lot of experience in project management, vast experience, and is actually considered to be one of the world's thought leaders on project management methods. He has been with PMI for many years, from the time it was founded, and has been a chapter president of the Central Ohio chapter. He's also founders of the PMP credential, the famous PMP credentials. The man who knows all about it, how they came up to have this credential and so forth. He's also a writer in his own right. He has written one of the bestsellers is called Project Management, the Common Sense Approach. He is currently into consulting with his company, the Lambert Consulting Group, and he enjoys very much sharing his knowledge with others. I know recently moving around virtually around the world in many countries. You tell us maybe how many countries, but I know he's been in many countries in the past few months having these presentations. And he speaks on leadership, communication, and management topics. If I really want to talk about him, then the presentation might actually end up being about him. So I'll just stop there for now and say thank you all for joining. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our speaker for tonight, Mr. Lee R. Lambert. Lee, if you can hear me, you can go ahead with your presentation.
What do we? Yeah. Can you hear me now? You hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
How about the slides? Do we have any luck with those? Can you post the slides on your end? They're not going up on AirMeet on my end.
Okay.
Okay, so while the slides are being sorted, may I just say maybe you are seeing the Flavius Coffee appearing twice. The other person is not Flavius Coffee, someone who is appearing as Flavius Coffee. That's Talengo Mtsambwa, who is our host and is the VP for communications. So bear with us, so I will just sort out the technical issues so that Lee can begin his presentation.
Is the presentation appearing? Hello?
Yes, the presentation is appearing.
Okay, Mr. Lambert, maybe you can go on. Okay.
Hey, there you go. All right, can you advance when I give you the green light?
Yes, please go ahead, Lee. The slides are appearing now,
Okay.
and we can clearly hear you.
Yeah, got him. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the technical problem. I have not used this air meet before, and it looked like I had a little problem with it. But let me give you some insights. I love the introduction, by the way. I thought it was a very nice way to say to all of the participants that I'm really, really old. I've been working in project management since I was just a wee lad. 54 years I've been doing this. About half private corporations, half consulting, and have had the opportunity to grow with the PMI. And I know you're a relatively new PMI chapter. I want you to understand the potential that comes with being involved with the PMI. I was a member of the third chapter that was chartered in Columbus, Ohio in 1973. And there are currently 302 chapters. So I've been around for a long time and experienced some of the benefits that the PMI brings to you. And that's really what brought this program about. I was a little concerned with this pandemic because it sort of really threw us all for a loop. And I'm used to going out and meeting with companies and providing training and consulting. And now I'm in my house basically for like 3 months now. And so I thought I got to do something to keep from going crazy. And so I decided to do what I call a world tour of a free webinar for any PMI chapter that wanted to take advantage of it. And we had about almost 60 chapters, including Zimbabwe, take advantage of this offer. So that's the nature of what I've done. Well, what got me going on this topic was in Philadelphia for the global symposium, if you will. The PMI new president, CEO, Sunil Prashara, latched onto this idea called the project economy. And basically, he really has been promoting the fact that everything that we do in our organizations are driven by the economies associated with projects. And so it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I've said since for probably 30 or 40 years, my opinion has been everything's a project and everybody's a project manager. So the key issue is how do I link everything up so that the organization is realizing the most benefits. So that's how this title, Strategic Design and Project Delivery, came about, is that I wanted to share with you some of the issues that are important for you in the world of project management to understand how to get the most benefit for your organization from the projects that you conduct. So I'm going to be and I'll be talking on the basis of two companies I spent some time working with. One was General Electric, probably even in Zimbabwe you've heard of General Electric. It's one of the most famous companies in the world. And then one that's even more famous is IBM. So I had a chance to work with those two companies on this particular topic. And so I'll share with you some specifics about how that all comes together. So when we get to the end, if you've got any questions left and we got any time left, we can address those as we get closer to the end. Okay, go ahead and advance that slide because I want to spend a little bit of time making sure that you understand that the methodology by which we manage projects really is important to recognize because it changes the way we do things. So if you can advance the slide for me, please. And the two things that I pointed out here in this slide is back in the olden days when I was but a child, we did everything on a predictive model. And basically, we got a scope of work defined for us. We got the organization assigned resources to the project. I was named project manager, and then we worked on that project till it was done. And then we got another project. So that's kind of the predictive model. And up until about 2001, that was really the primary model that we used in project management. And then the evolution of IT project management, which then gravitated into agile or hybrid, came along and gave us another option. And that option actually has some significant value in that. One of the big complaints I had in the olden days was that we didn't have very clearly defined requirements. So it was kind of shooting in the dark trying to get a project done when we didn't really have definitive requirements. Well, the agile approach addressed this issue and admitted right up front, no, we don't know all the requirements. We don't know what they all are. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with what we do know and then sort of evolve into, it's called the elaborative approach, or the evolutionary approach. And so those are the two primary ways. In fact, in the new PMBOK, if you're familiar with that, the new PMBOK is divided into two compartments. 50% of it will be predictive, the old style, and 50% of it will be agile, the new style. So that's a massive change from what it has been. In fact, the most current version is 90 to 95% predictive and 5 to 10% agile. So we've got to modify that. So my point I want to make to you is understand what your organization uses. Understand what the organization feels is the most appropriate for the work that you're doing, and then allow yourself to adapt to that particular mold, because that's going to make a big difference. And once you understand that, then you're prepared to go to the next step. Okay, advance the slide, please. The next step is the idea of strategy itself. This is the problem that I see in the world that I deal in on a regular basis. I'm a real common sense kind of guy. I mean, I'm one of the founders of the PMP process, and I'm common sense. Okay, so common sense says to me, how can I execute a project when I don't know where that project fits in the strategic planning of the organization? So let me review a little bit about how that happens. And I'm sure it's no different in Zimbabwe as it is in the U.S. So let's look at this. So at a certain time each fiscal year, the senior level people in the organization, the C-level, CIO, CFO, COO, CEO, I mean all the C-level guys go away, and their role is to plan what they plan to do in the coming year. In other words, how are we going to capitalize on our resources, our capabilities, our future to deliver the most value to the organization? So they hammer these things out. When they're done, they usually have 4 or 5 what I'll call strategic objectives. And they may be, let's say one is to increase profitability. Well, that could be tied into decreasing cost, or that could be tied into increasing market share. And so they come up with these strategic objectives, and they become the reason why we do things. Well, what we have to recognize in project management is one of those strategic objectives may spawn 4 or 5 individual projects. And those projects, and now we've started to put them in what we call a portfolio, where they're like projects supporting like kinds of objectives. And then we have those grouped, and we manage that as a portfolio so that we can do trade-offs within the portfolio to make sure that we're supporting the strategic objective. Now, the problem is, you see, in project management, we say in the PMBOK that every project starts with a project charter. So somebody has to prepare a charter that gives you basically the scope and some target budget and target time, and that becomes the initiating document for a project. Well, the problem is, in that document, typically, although there are some exceptions, but typically there's no reference to what strategic objectives that particular project supports or is an input to, if you want to look at it that way. And so you should have that. And if you don't have it, and you probably won't, when you get your project charter, one of the first things you need to find out is what strategic objective does this support. And I'll explain to you why it's vital information. Because otherwise what happens is we end up doing projects just for the sake of doing projects. And we don't really know what contribution that makes to the overall success of the organization. And I need to know that. If I'm going to be held accountable for delivering a project, I need to know why that's so important. I need to know how much leverage do I have, how much empowerment can I get based on where my project fits in the strategic objectives. So we want to be able to identify the strategy. What's the strategy that's associated with my project? Next slide. Now, what happens in organizations is many of us, we don't really worry about this. We're so focused on the triple constraint, scope, time, cost, that we just basically bury our head in the sand and just keep going forward. We don't really ask ourselves, well, what would the long-range impact be? What were the risk issues I should be paying attention? We just smoke it. We just go as hard and as fast as we can in order to get things done for that particular project. Well, that's not going to work. In today's strategic objective-oriented organization, remember, here's the problem we face. Every organization has resource limitations. Either human resource or financial resource or facility resource. We have limitations. And so we've got to make sure that when these C-level people come back with their projects, they haven't approved more projects than we have the capability to conduct. So we can't keep our head in the sand. We got to pay attention and make sure that we're looking at things from the right perspective. Next slide. This is what you end up with. If you look at this next slide, you can see this may be the biggest problem that I face, and I don't know if you all face this or not, but the biggest problem that I face in the project management world is getting the right priority. So I know what objective it supports. I've got that clear in my mind. I've asked that question and they've given me some answers. But now I want to know, what's its relative priority? Remember, you may have going on in your company, in your organization, you may have 20, 30, 40 projects going on. And now you've got to decide, how important is your project? Where is it in the priority pecking order, if you will? And the reason that's important is knowing where your priority is knowing what level of influence you can have on the decision maker. And what happens is most of the C-level people, they kind of look at their project work as priority number one. Well, you can't have more than one priority one. I learned this at GE. GE came up with a business document that listed 25 what they called mission critical projects. and each one of them was listed as priority one. Like, you can't have 25 priority ones. And so we need to sort through what's the priority based on the contribution that it's going to make to the organization. So you've got to make sure that we clarify in that regard. Now let me give you an IBM example. I don't know if any of you are using laptop computers, but back in the olden days when I was a young kid, IBM ThinkPad, that was the one everybody wanted. I want to buy a ThinkPad, okay? Well, in 1993, IBM was projecting an $8 billion, with a big B, $8 billion loss. So they fired their CEO, a guy named Jack Aker, and brought in a guy named Lou Gerstner to turn the company around. Okay. Well, I didn't know anything about Lou, but I was working at IBM at the time, working with them on some training programs, and so I got to observe how Lou operated. Well, he came in, and the first thing he did was he spent about 2 months out in the field talking to all the different divisions and parts of the organization and individual departments. And then finally, at the end of 2 months, he gathered the senior level decision makers together, and here's what he said. He said, listen, what I found is that IBM has left their core principles behind. They have become too many things to too many people. We have too darn many projects, and we're spread too thin to be successful in any of them. So what we're going to do is we're going to cancel 60% of the projects we're currently doing and focus our attention on the remaining 40% and do those extremely well. Well, one of those happened to be the ThinkPad. It was one of their primary products. But here's the idea. Lou didn't see that fitting into the strategic direction that he saw IBM going, and so he sold the ThinkPad. And guess who he sold it to? China. So now it's Lenovo. The Lenovo brand is the old ThinkPad. Well, he made a strategic decision based on prioritization of what projects he could do and what projects he couldn't do, and turned that company around. In 3 years' time, IBM was profitable again thanks to the efforts of Lou Gerstner in terms of identifying strategic direction and then picking the projects that added the most value. Okay, next slide, please. So in order to do this, you have to create, now this is just my term, I don't care what you call it, but you have to create what I call a strategic office, okay? And this office is going to be the place where everything comes together. When IBM formed its new approach, he also formed what he called the IBM Project Management Center of Excellence. Well, it was a big PMO. I mean, now PMOs, everybody's got one, but back then they didn't. But that's what it was, a PMO. And that's where all this information comes together. So all of the constraints or the limitations and the resource allocation, everything came together at the Center of Excellence. Well, I'm proposing the same kind of idea. I don't care what you call it, but it's someplace where we can look at all of the information and see how it all fits together and see what impact it's having or will have on the success or failure of the organization. It's easy to think about it in terms of project management because we have this concept called the work breakdown structure. I'm sure you're familiar with that, the WBS, and that's the vertical hierarchy. That takes the project from the top level down to the work package level, down to that lower level where we assign resources and money and time and all the things that go along to supporting the project. That's one project, and we should do that with every single project, okay? And we got to integrate those because today we work in a matrix. So gone are the days when you get a dedicated team like I used to get. Now you got to beg, borrow, and steal your resources from other projects because there's a shared resource base, and that shared resource has to supply support to all the projects. Now you're starting to see Why priority understanding is important? If you know your project's priority 1, you have a much higher likelihood of getting the people you need to do that project than someone who's 25 out of 25. So we've got the vertical hierarchy. That's the easy part. Okay, we merge that data. Now we've got to look at the horizontal data. This is the new piece that we don't do as well as we should or could. And the new piece says basically we have to integrate all of the horizontal information, the resource pools, the facility utilization, all of those residual components that aren't inherently considered part of the project, and make sure that all of those fit together. Now remember, when we merge all this information, as soon as one thing happens on the project, I can immediately assess what the impact is, not only on the project, but on the organization. Integrated data set, that's what we need to have. That's why we have to design it strategically. We've got to design it in a way that we can merge all of that data, and as we're delivering the project, we can coordinate decisions around that information. Now this takes automation, no doubt about that, but there's plenty of automation capability out there. I mean, there's so darn many software packages, I can't hardly count them, but you need something that will handle it. When I was at GE in the very beginning, 1966, by the way, was when I started in this business, and I used to use a pencil and an abacus. That's it. We didn't have the computers, and then we had mainframes, and then we had a laptop, and then, well, now we got my 7-year-old granddaughters, twin granddaughters, can do more with the computer right now than I ever could. And so we have the automated capability, but if you don't provide the structure, if you don't provide the interface capability, having that power of computation doesn't really add any value. So we've got to pay attention to how that all fits together. Next slide, please. Well, here's the important part. These are the stakeholders. Now, we use this term stakeholder. It gets abused, actually. We use it too darn much. But the fact of the matter is we've begun to realize in project management the criticality of the stakeholders. Okay? Because basically project management is about communication. We communicate, and then ultimately someone has to make a decision based on what we've communicated. So stakeholder management was a new chapter that was added to the PMBOK in the 5th edition that really addressed the importance of stakeholder management. So I want to spend a minute going through the criticality of how this all fits together. At the top of this slide, which I didn't put the name in there, but I'm going to tell you about it, is called the control stakeholder. Now, the control stakeholder is, you guessed it, in control. Well, what that means is anybody who has the ability to change your project, to stop your project, to start your project, by definition becomes a control stakeholder. Control stakeholder doesn't want all this detail. They don't want all this inordinate detail. They just want the high-level, basic information that will help them be comfortable that the project's moving in the direction it needs to move. So control stakeholders. Now, at least one of them will always be a signatory on the project charter, but some may not be. Like, for example, legal might be a control stakeholder, but they don't actively appear on the stakeholder study in many cases. So you got to realize anybody that can have that effect on the project are by definition a control stakeholder. Okay. Now this group that you see in front of you, these are the what we call the impact or influence stakeholders, and that basically says anybody that's working on the project by definition can have an impact on the project, and you as a project certainly can have an impact on it. So you're all impact or influence project stakeholders. Okay. But there's some other stakeholders that fall in this category, and that's where we've got the people who, the resource pool owners. Remember I said we got to beg, borrow, and steal? Let's say we need 3 engineers. Well, we got to go to the engineering resource pool and fight for those 3 because there's 4 other projects fighting for them too. So we've got to have them as stakeholders. We have to know that they're aware of what we're doing and when we're doing it and how we're doing it, so that they can make better, more informed resource allocation decisions. So they're influence or impact stakeholders. So anybody whose activity or action can have an impact on or influence the outcome of our project falls into this category. This is by far and away the biggest group of people. And remember, a communication plan, really put it in simplicity, identifies to whom we will communicate, what form and format, and what frequency. And then what our expectations are as a result. So it's not brain surgery. And so we've got that. Now the third one is one that people argue with me that they don't really exist. So I'm gonna share with you an $11 billion story that confirms how important these stakeholders are. Now, what I call them is information stakeholders. These are people who don't have control, they don't have influence, but they're interested in what you're doing. Now, people say, well, if they're not on the project, why do I want to pay attention to them? Well, because from the organizational perspective, it could add significant amount of value, because information stakeholders generally are worried about what you're doing in a way that they can apply it to what they're going to be doing in the future, or maybe even what they're doing right now. Learn from your mistakes. I call this a living closeout process. So the information stakeholders, I want to keep them in the loop because I may need them. I may need their advice. I may need their support. Okay? All right, so here's where the $11 billion came from. I was retained by a company called Behringer Mannheim, owned by the Engelhorn family in Mannheim, Germany, but operating out of Castleton, Indiana, making medical diagnostics equipment. One of their primary products was a blood glucose monitoring home use device for diabetics. Okay, and they'd been hammered in the market by Johnson & Johnson with a new product that was better, faster, cheaper, all the worst things you could ever hear. And so they hired me to execute what they called a miracle project. It typically took 3 years. They wanted it in 18 months. And they had projected that if they didn't get it 18 months, they would probably end up closing the door because they would have lost so much market share to Johnson & Johnson. It wouldn't have made sense to continue operation. So I negotiated unlimited power. First time and only time I've ever had that. And so I started to staff the team. Now they had about 2,000 people. I was going to need about 200 to do this project. So the focus was on chemistry, because this is a blood interaction with chemistry to give readings of blood glucose in your bloodstream. And so I focused on, I get 25. I picked 25 out of 100 of the best chemists in the organization. And immediately I heard grousing. I heard upset. People were mad that they weren't picked. They'd been there a long time. They deserved to be on the team. And it was going to cause a problem. So I had to address it right away. So what I said was, to the 75 people I didn't pick, I said, I'd like you to get together with the 25 I did pick and just exchange information. Every Friday for 2 hours in the afternoon, get together with no agenda, no expectations, just chit-chat about what you're doing and how you're doing it. Okay? Well, that seemed to satisfy them. So that went on for 4 weeks. At the end of 4 weeks, we got to get on. We got a very tight schedule. This is an 18-month project, usually 3 years. And so we got on with the project. By the way, we got the project done in 18 months. It was written up in a magazine. PMI wrote it up, called it a miracle project. So, I mean, it was super successful, okay? And started gathering market share. Market share was coming back to us tenfold. It was just, we couldn't keep up with the market share. And so after 3 years, Roche Laboratories evaluated the organization and recognized the benefits of having that organization, and they acquired Behringer Mannheim from the Engelhorn family for $11 billion. Now, at the time, that was a $1 billion company. $11 billion, okay? That was 3 years after we went into the marketplace. Now, the reason I want you to know this is that the chemistry that we developed that led to this significant acquisition was not developed by my project chemists. It was developed by the functional chemists in some of the work that they were doing. My guys couldn't get her done. These guys did, and therefore it went forward. Now, we didn't make a big deal out of that, and I didn't even tell anybody for a long time, but that convinced me that the information stakeholder has significant potential value. So when you're looking at your communication stream, when you're looking at your communications plan, make sure you include the people that can add significant value, whether they are dedicated to your project or not. Okay, next slide. Now, in order to do all of this, of course, we have the ability to call on our tool chest. I've heard so many times, I hear this, what's in your project management toolbox? Well, you know what's in there? Too darn much is in there. That's what. We got too darn many tools. Every year, now I've been around 54 years in PM, every year more tools are coming out. And sadly, they're not adding much value. It's another way to do it, but it's the same thing that we've been doing, just another way to do it. And so I've taken a hard look at the tools from a project management perspective, and here's where I come down. I think that there are 3 basic tools that I insist. If I were to come to your organization and ask you to inform me of how you're going about managing your project, this is what I would expect. I'd expect to see a very well-developed work breakdown structure. My definition of a WBS is it's the foundation of all things project management. Think about that for a second. The work breakdown structure defines work content, assigns skill set match, estimates the cost for resources, and so on and so on. So you can start to see that it's the foundation of all things project. Everything builds on the work breakdown structure. Okay? So I got to have that. Second one is I've got to have a critical path schedule. There's no exception. I've got to have a critical path schedule. And so that means I've got to be able to take all those work packages and sequence them in an output-input relationship and then calculate where the critical path is, where the float paths are. That's the flexibility I have as a project manager to move things around. If they're on the float paths, I got flexibility. If they're on the critical path, I don't. So I got to have WBS, got to have critical path schedule. Now, third one is I don't know if you'd call it a tool, I call it a tool, is the risk management concept. Risk management is where average project managers become superstars because they think about, they anticipate, they mitigate the effects of a risk event occurring before it occurs. You want to earn your stripes. You want to get a big bonus. You want to be a star in your organization. Learn how to be an effective project risk management person. That's the key. Now, so those 3 things you got to have. Now, we got lots of other things. There's lots of other tools. New tools are coming out every year. But those are the 3. Now, you'll notice in my graphic here, I've actually left out the most important tool, common sense. I think I've seen too many times people get so buried in unbelievable levels of detail and information that they are reluctant or don't bother to make decisions. So know your tools, know what's available, know what adds value. Don't be afraid to say, no, I really don't think I want to use that on this particular project. I don't think it's going to add any substantial value. So, we know I know there's ABB's got a presence here in Columbus, Ohio. I see that Flavius is an ABB person. You could go in there and you could find they're using all these tools and then some. I mean, they got all the bells and whistles. We've trained thousands of those people around the world, and so but you got to be smart enough to make that choice. Okay, you got to make that choice. Now you'll see, based on what I've told you so far, most of my emphasis is on the project manager doing their job. The strategic objective people, they do their job up front, and then our job is to make sure that we keep them honest, that we hold their feet to the fire, and make sure that we're delivering what they really need to meet their strategic objectives. All right, next slide, please. Now, I threw this one in just as a sort of a, I don't know what you'd call it, it's just a kind of a lighthearted approach that lets the software management people recognize that we haven't forgotten them, we haven't eliminated them. There still are people, believe it or not, there still are people who are doing waterfall software project management. Okay, not many. There's not many, because I think Agile Scrum has sort of taken over that spot in the business. But there are some, and usually it's the old folk, not old, well, yeah, old folk that have kind of grown up with waterfall. They understand waterfall, and they sure don't want to spend time learning a new approach like Agile Scrum. So I do a lot of teaching for the LDS Church in Salt Lake City, and they have an incredible information systems group. And when you go up the escalator to the second floor where they're located, if you look off to your left, you'll see a group of 6 or 8, maybe 10 at the very most, people working in their offices there. And then to the right are like literally 100 or more people working on the same desks and same environment. But on the left-hand side are the waterfall people. And the reason I know the waterfall people is they're old. They're the old people. The agile Scrum people are the new people who have caught on to this idea. It was implemented in 2001. The manifesto was written in a nice little ski resort in Utah. And since then, it's been 19 years, so it's not like this is an overnight success, but it's been proven to be very effective in the appropriate situation. Okay, now there are zealots. Every process has zealots. There are zealots who say that'll work for everything. Well, I can't believe that an elaborative agile program will work on a road construction, on a building construction, on a dam construction. Those projects don't lend themselves to elaboration of scope. They're designed early on to do a certain function, and they don't morph into it. It's already designed. So just realize that there still are waterfall people out there, and some of them have done great job on projects for years. So it's not as though we've shipped them out to pasture, so to speak. But in fact, the matter we really are counting on them to continue to hold up their area of expertise. Now, in the new PMBOK, they have the 150% component is called Agile Hybrid. And what we mean by that is there are some projects where Agile might be 80% of the methodology that we use, but on the other 20% that doesn't lend itself to Agile, we can use a waterfall or even a more traditional approach. So we've got that kind of a division of capabilities, if you will, that go into it. Now, give me the next slide. This is an important slide only because it sort of brings back to you why we do what we do. So here's the evolution of Agile. Now, it's created this new role called the Scrum Master, and the Scrum Master has, in many cases, displaced the PMP, the one that's held court since 1984, that we got 1.2 million of them around the world today. Well, the Scrum Master has moved into some of the roles that the PMP used to play. In fact, I get calls. I've had 3 calls today, just today. I've had 3 calls asking me, as a founder of the PMP, asking me, what should I pursue? Should I get the PMP or should I get the Scrum Master? Well, here's my answer. It's an easy one. The answer is yes. Get them both. Get them both. Cover your bases. That's called an insurance policy, because the Scrum Master's taken over some, but not all. The PMP still has plenty of very important work to do. And so then if you switch away from an agile environment, that PMP is going to come in handy. But what I wanted to do with this graphic is point out to you how this all started, because it really makes all the sense when you think about it this way. The whole idea of agile is sort of an offshoot of the sports game called rugby. Think about this for a minute. In rugby, you know, the opposite players, they all get in a big circle and they're holding on and pushing and shoving, and then somebody throws the ball. In this case, I've called it the requirements. Throws the ball in there, and people start pushing, shoving, biting, and kicking, and finally the ball squirts out on the other side. Somebody runs over there and runs as far as they can before they're tackled, and they have to have another scrum. Well, that's exactly agile. We don't know all the requirements when we start, so we have a, quote, scrum, and out of that scrum we modify, expand, change the requirements, and keep moving on, delivering usable output much sooner by utilizing the agile approach. So there's nothing magic about it. It's got some big benefits for those of us who have complained for years that that's a lousy requirements document. I have no idea what you're going to hold me accountable for. So this gives me a little bit of an opportunity to flex along with that process. Okay? Next slide, because there's a role for you now. I mean, it's really amazing at how many people have embraced the idea of agile, and so once you're convinced it's a reasonable approach to executing projects, and you feel like you're supportive of it, that's the easy part of the job. The next part of the job is to convince the decision makers. Now remember, they might have been the ones that asked you to look into Agile, but they didn't really expect you to come away thinking, wow, we got to get this. Because you see, it's expensive. It's time consuming. I've incorporated 4 enterprise-wide project management systems, okay? And the longest one took 4 years, and the shortest one took 2 years. So it takes time. IBM probably a year, with the CEO pushing every minute of the way. So you need to be prepared if you're convinced. Now, if you're not convinced, you'll have a hard time selling it, but you need to be prepared to sell the idea to the decision makers. So that they incorporate it into their strategic thinking in how they're going to go about efficiently executing projects. Okay? All right, last slide, and then I'm going to open it up for some questions. The last slide actually has some relevance to what we've been talking about. This is a friend of mine. Actually, I have 2 people that look pretty much just like this. And that's because they didn't listen. They didn't take advice. So I want to share it with you just so you have it in the back of your mind. Both of these guys were driven, I've known them for years, were driven by the triple constraint concept that we've pronounced to be the way projects get managed constantly, okay? Scope, time, cost, scope, time, cost, those 3 components. And you balance the scope, time, cost, and if you do a good job of that, you deliver a successful project. Well, the problem got to be with these 2 guys is, what did success mean? Well, to them, it meant scope, time, cost. We met or exceeded the scope, time, cost targets. To them, that was absolutely a success. Well, because of strategic thinkers, that didn't always mean it was a success. In other words, they delivered scope, time, cost at a price to the impact on strategy. So if they'd have been thinking strategically, they would have been able to make some decisions that while they may have moved away from the original defined scope, time, cost targets, they're now moving in the direction of increasing the contribution to the strategic objectives. And you must understand, your organization, I don't care how big or how small it is. I had a chance to work with some people in Zambia. They're getting into project management big. I just got a call last week from Rwanda. I'm going to get a chance to talk with them. I mean, it doesn't matter if your organization's big or small. It all operates based on some strategic objectives. Okay, so these guys were called in on the carpet by the strategic thinkers of the organization, and they said to them, "Look, great job on scope, time, cost, but you disconnected from the strategic objectives. And while we've got a nice project in terms of scope, time, cost, it's not making the contribution we'd hoped for regarding the strategy. So listen." They were told, listen, don't do that again. Pay attention to the strategy. Don't ever disconnect from the strategy as you're executing the project. And they said, okay, yeah, sure, okay. Well, they did it again. They did it again. I warned them. They did it again. And both of these guys who are, as I'm saying, they're good guys. They know the business. Both of these guys were fired. They were let go because they disconnected from the organization's strategic objectives. So the message I have for you is once you begin to work on a project, once you define a project plan, then make sure you've identified the interfaces with the strategic objectives that project supports. Because as soon as you start to disconnect from the strategic objectives, your career is at risk. So it's your decision. The software is available to support it. The concepts are well known. So it's really up to individuals to capitalize on the capabilities that we have in today's project management to assure that we'll connecting to the strategic objectives of that organization. Okay, that's all my formal presentation. I try to leave a little time for questions, and I'd be happy to answer any if you have some.
Yes, there are some questions, Mr. Lambert. There are some questions on the questions tab there. Do you want to go through them, or should I read them out for you? Oh, all right. So the first question was, what is the relationship between the strategic office and the PMO?
Well, it depends on the way the organization is structured. This question comes up a lot. I think oftentimes they're the same. The strategic office and the project management office oftentimes serve the same function. So you have to be careful not to overlap functionality between the two offices, or then you end up with conflict and the value isn't realized.
Thank you very much for answering that one. Another question here says, how much of benefits realization management influences strategy design and engagement prioritization? And how does this affect a holding setup with different strategic business units?
Well, I think you're always going to run into that. You know, the saying we have here in the States is that there's more than one way to skin a cat. And what we mean by that is no matter what the project is, there's always going to be alternative ways to do it. And so what the project manager has to consider is what's going to be the most efficient way to deliver this project and stay connected to the strategy. Because sometimes when we make a decision on execution, it actually pulls us away from the strategic objective. So you've got to be smart enough to recognize there's several ways you can do things, but you got to make sure that you stay connected to the strategy. If you start to propose that you're going to move away from the strategy, that decision will not be well received by the organization.
Good, thank you very much. We still have another question. This one says, is COE an advanced form of PMO?
Say that once more.
He says, is COE an advanced form of PMO?
No. That in fact it's CEO, not COE. It's CEO, Chief Operating. COO, Chief Operating Officer, is one's Chief Executive Officer.
He's referring to the Center of Excellence. The Center of Excellence.
Yeah. The Center of Excellence for IBM. Yeah, that was not equivalent to the CEO. The CEO was Lou Gerstner, and the head of the PMO, Center of Excellence, was a lady named Carol Wright. And she actually had two people in between her and the CEO.
Okay, so this Center of Excellence, can we say it's some form of PMO?
Yeah, exactly. That's what they never did call it a PMO. In fact, to this very day, they don't call it a PMO, but it was the first of many PMOs that came about. So they chose not to call it PMO for whatever reason. I don't really know. But that's exactly what it was. It was the IBM Center of Excellence, or PMO.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are all the questions that we had for tonight. And I'd like to thank you so much for taking your time to visit us all the way here in Zimbabwe virtually and share this knowledge, all those insights, all that history, and all that advice on the future of work when it comes to project management. I'm sure all the members, all the attendees got something that they can actually think about and apply in their practice. So thank you all. The session is being recorded. It will be shared via our chapter's website, so you can look out for it in case you missed 1 or 2 points there. So as we end the session, we will also keep the platform open for about 15 minutes for some networking. Lee, if you don't mind, maybe you can hang around for a few minutes in the lounge. Some attendees can come to your table there. Maybe you say hi, say 1 or 2 things, maybe ask a few other additional questions. So the session is officially over. We'll just have some minutes for networking. Thank you so much. So what happens is, as soon as the session is closed, you see the option for the lounge. There will be various tables there. So you see that there are about 4 chairs on each table. Just press where it says take a seat. You can also be able to see which table is occupied, who is there. And let's just familiarize with the platform and also get to know each other. And networking is very important as for our professional development. Thank you.